When we first moved into this church, which was 1994, we moved from a storefront, an office suite over on California Avenue, just reminiscing, which a person of my age is allowed to do. The day that we moved from that site to this, we decided the most practical way to move was to do a procession. And so we picked up all the pictures in the temple, everyone that we had, and we chanted, down the street and came into here. When I actually announced to the congregation that we were going to do that, some people discreetly left early. Americans, as Swamiji said, have great heart, great generosity of heart and great heart for spirituality, but we have this other characteristic is that we are very careful. We never want to appear foolish, which does not serve us spiritually. So the idea of marching in any part of Palo Alto, holding a picture of the masters, singing hallelujah or whatever we were singing. I mean, in any Latin American country and all over India, you'd be respected for doing it. But in America, it was a little harder pill to swallow for some. The rest of us have overcome that obstacle a long time ago. And we just marched in and came in the front door and carried all our pictures up here. It looked entirely different up here. There was just this big wooden table and put all the masters here. It was an extraordinary moment. I mean, we really felt like we brought the masters from one place and installed them in another. And those of you who were quite a few in the room, who was there? Besides, you see. Everyone who was there, it was a moment to remember because God's presence was real. But when it came time to make this look a little more like our own temple, we had this idea to put the spiritual eye, which is the Star of Bethlehem, which is up at the top of our altar. Because this temple was one of the early temples that Ananda acquired or built afterwards, and we had so much real estate here. We were used to having very tiny places. The concept of what was possible on an altar here became literally greatly enlarged. Pictures could be bigger, everything could be bigger, and whereas the spiritual eye had appeared occasionally on altars, it was about as big as a dinner plate, which you can imagine in this context would have been just like a little pinpoint, barely that. And in for a penny, in for a pound, we thought, let's just make it as big as we can make it, which, again, the American temperament between devotion, childlike devotion, and not wanting to appear foolish began to kick in. And at the beginning, I had a little bit of trouble persuading people that we could have a spiritual eye that was 5 feet across. So unable to persuade people in words. Words are very vivid to me. If someone says it's 5 feet across, I see it. I've gradually learned from my friends that words don't mean the same thing to everyone. So one night, I just came here and I got cardboard and I got Christmas wrap, bright Christmas wrap, and I just made this huge cardboard version of the spiritual eye and tacked it up on the wall so that people could see what it would look like if it was that big. And after a while, people said, oh, not so bad. But Swami Kriyananda was still living, and there was still, he lived until 2013, so he was with us, and he was the arbiter of such things. So when he came to visit, I put it up also to show it to him, and I asked him, is this appropriate? Because we're defining Master's works for generations to come, and merely because I like it doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do. And I was not so stupid as not to know that. I really wanted to know, and he had 2 points of view on it, which were really perfect. He said, however you place it on the altar, you should have to raise your eyes slightly to see it, which was actually very astute because when we meditate, there are 3 positions of the eyes. Downward, which is subconsciousness. I often say, as a public speaker, I have the opportunity to watch adults fall asleep, which is something that other people don't usually get to do. Fortunately, it doesn't happen often, but sometimes people have had a hard day. I'm just going to put it like that. They've had a long day. And so I'll watch them and their eyes drop. So I definitely know what subconsciousness looks like. Straight ahead is how we relate to the world around us. And then when we meditate, we look, people say toward the spiritual eye, but you're not turning your eyes inward. You're raising your eyes above the horizon line. So Swamiji felt it was important when you sit in this temple that you have to make that gesture to see the spiritual eye. But he said that, and then when he walked in and he saw it, my big Christmas wrap version of it, I said, is that too big? He said, oh, no, not at all. He said, the spiritual eye should look so big that you feel that you can walk right into it. It's just a beautiful idea, isn't it, that we should walk right into it. And one of the reasons also that it seemed appropriate to put it very large and above the masters, quite apart from Swami's comment about the eyes, is that we need to understand why we have the masters on the altar at all. Like, who are they? Why are they there? In the position that I've been in for so many years, I get asked all the questions. And so I begin to understand, why are we worshiping individuals? If God is in all of us, why do we have pictures on the altar? You know, just all the obvious questions that you would ask. Why are there no women? Which has come more recently, but that comes often. Because being an avatar is a masculine job. Not a job for men, but it's a masculine job. It's an outward moving, life-changing. That's one explanation. It takes masculine energy to be an avatar. You don't just come to inspire, you come to actually change the world. Swami also commented when I asked him, of course he's asked also, first you just say, they can choose, and they choose, so what can you say to that? But he also said, let's see now, the thought escaped me for a moment. Oh, isn't that odd? Well, whatever it was he said, I can't remember. Isn't that weird? Maybe all I meant to say was that they have a choice and they're able to choose for themselves. Strange, complete blank out there. But in any case, what we have to understand is what we're looking at when we're looking at that consciousness, and that's the whole story of Jesus. You know, there's a wonderful aspect to traditional Christianity, and I like to read biographies of spiritual people of all traditions, because anybody who loves God and has real power in that love is an inspiration to me. I read a book, and I don't remember the title or anything that would identify it, unfortunately, for the sake of recommending, but it was about a young woman who married a man who was a missionary, and they went to some part of the world. This was just before World War II, that put them in a position to be captured by the Japanese. So she ended up, after just a couple of years of marriage and missionary work, she ends up a prisoner of war in a Japanese camp, which was a very arduous position for her to be in. But the story is about the relationship she had with Jesus, and that relationship being so vivid and so powerful for her that literally miracles happened for her, and she suffered, but she survived. She converted some of those who were imprisoning her, and went on to, you know, that experience, which was extremely difficult in itself, nonetheless forged in her this powerful spirituality that then served her for the rest of her life. And all of it was in this extremely personal in the sense of individual relationship with Jesus, in which there was no doubt in her mind of his power, his love for her, his presence, his response to her prayers. Now, sometimes we get very sophisticated in our theology, you know, in our philosophy, in our understanding. And sometimes we forget that Jesus himself said, "Suffer little children to come unto me," that we lose the power of that simple clarity and all of this effort to become very sophisticated. There's a place, and it's not in autobiography, I don't think, but it's in some other book about Master, where he talks about his devotion for Master Mahashaya. Master Mahashaya means great soul. Mahashaya simply means great soul. It's the title also that Lahiri Mahashaya has. Master Mahashaya, described in the autobiography, was not Yogananda's guru. his guru came later. It was Sri Yukteswar, whose picture is on our altar. Master Mahashaya was a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. But he was such a great soul that Master Yogananda had a very deep and heartfelt relationship to him. It was he who beseeched to give him a vision of the Divine Mother. And he talks all the time about how close he was with him. And it's a whole chapter in Autobiography of a Yogi, which speaks to the closeness between Ramakrishna and Yogananda to many things that are not the subject of this discussion today. But somewhere it's described how Master had so much reverence for Master Mahashaya that after Mahashaya walked, Master lay on the ground and rolled in the dust where he had stepped. Isn't that an amazing thought? I've shared this with you, but many years ago, there was a man who came, Swami Bodhicitananda, who's an American man who's lived in India for many years, a dear friend and a wonderful soul. And he was very close with the Shivananda lineage. He brought a film, just little film clips that somebody took of Shivananda, who was also a great guru, contemporaneous with Yogananda. And in that picture, these very exotic-looking sadhus, the way you see in India, with the big dreadlocks curled on their head and the sort of tattered clothes and the staff, just your perfect picture of the Indian sadhu. And they come down from the Himalayas every so often. This is all in the film. And they're there to see their guru, Shivananda. And Shivananda walks away from his, and these 2 or 3 men, again, just fall on the ground and roll in the dust that has been made sacred because the foot of the guru stepped there. Imagine. Now, I mean, it's almost inconceivable for any of us to even see ourselves doing such a thing unless it was an affectation. Oh, this is what a devoted person would do, this is what I'll do. In the life of Jesus, but the point of that, and I want to go back to that for a moment, the point of it, that using that word affectation, and I don't mean that it's insincere, but that it would come from thought. When I watched that film footage of those sadhus going down to the ground where Shivananda, their guru, had stepped, you could see it in the film that it was not a thought. It was the spontaneous reaction of their soul to a divine opportunity that was put in front of them. You could feel that there was no part of them that decided to do it. They were just drawn. Just drawn almost without any conscious will. I mean, and that was what made it just so startling to see. It's amazing how consciousness is conveyed, not by words and actions, but by something so much more subtle. And it's that so much more subtle that really gives the power to our spiritual lives. And that's what I was so impressed with reading about that woman trapped in the prisoner of war camp, was that it was her vibration. It wasn't her ideas. It was nothing that, we could have a discussion about. It was just who she had become from all her years and all her life of devoted service and practice and relationship. It wasn't something that she was trying to create in the moment. It was something that just spontaneously came out of her at all times. This is just who she was. As many of you have heard me mention, I exercise by swimming at the YMCA, and one of the things that happens there sometimes is they have these swimming classes for parents and babies, little babies, to get them used to the water. And I always am really happy when they come in because I can just sort of hover over there in the corner and just watch these extremely intimate relationships between fathers and children or mothers and children. And then last few days ago when I was there, it was clearly the grandparents. And the grandparents had this, how tiny babies are. I mean, I'm always so amazed. they're so like little, you know. So he's really little, and he's kind of gripping his grandpa's back like this, and grandmother is hovering like this. And, you know, he's just one soul out of billions on the planet, this little being. But I see the new grandparents over in the corner over here looking at each other and beaming, thinking about Priya and Bhima over here have a new grandchild. But in any case, it's only one soul out of billions of souls. But there's a relationship. And there's no thought in that relationship. This is not an idea of how I should feel. This is simply who I am. Now, that's what true spirituality is. It's not theology, it's not where you attend, it's not the box you put it in. It's simply who we are. Now, in our reading today, I was going to give you one more example. In the Bible, they have that story about Mary Magdalene in the last days of Jesus' life, coming in to where he was having dinner with all his disciples. And in those days, the men and women were kept to a large extent separate. So he was meeting with his male disciples, and Mary Magdalene comes in, and she does not have a high reputation. She was said to be a very wealthy and successful courtesan, which is what Jesus brought her out of to become his devoted disciple. So she had long since stopped worrying about what people thought. She'd chosen a path in life that made their opinions quite irrelevant to her. And she had this relationship with Jesus. And she came into this dinner. She went in front of him. She knelt in front of him. And she bathed his feet. And she anointed him with this costly ointment. And she used her long hair as the towel. And, you know, everyone else is sitting around. And even in the Bible, they're sort of saying to each other, this is really a little much. Don't you think so? You know, and they even wanted Jesus to tell her to stop. But he refused because he knew that this was not an affectation or a thought on her part. He was there. She knew he was there. He had rescued her from a life of sadness and despair. It's not the question of the morality. It was the inner tragedy of it for her. That was what she was rescued from, was from the sadness of life without God. And she needed to give back to him in the only way she could think of. And he knew exactly what she was doing, and he commended her. And he praised her above those who were so tidy in their devotion that it would never occur to them to roll in the dust where the Guru had walked. Now, it's important for us to understand not to measure ourselves as less, but to measure our potential as to what it really is. In our reading, Swami tells us this story about how he was trying to understand Master's consciousness. And Master, who said to Swami, he said, I know every thought that you think. I know every thought that everyone thinks. But as my disciple, I know every thought that you think. And Swami said, that was quite a statement. It was given to him when he was very new on the path. And he said, one could be quite disconcerted by that. He said, but Swamiji welcomed it. And that's what our reading says today. Just bring God with you in everything that you do. He knows anyway. You know, you're merely shutting the door of your mind does not keep the Guru's presence out. It just makes it impossible for him to work with us. Because if we're hiding, he won't intrude. As Swami said, Master demonstrated many times that it was true. So Swami's there trying to grasp Master's consciousness, and in sympathy, Master says, if you only knew my consciousness. You know, you're trying to reach up to it, but you have no idea. And yesterday, when we were having our all-day meditation, Master recommended that we memorize the poem Samadhi, the stele on the walls here with these verses. These are from the poem Samadhi, and the whole poem is on the back wall in a frame there for those of you who don't know it, vanished the veils of light and shade, lifted every vapor of sorrow. I've memorized it and forgotten it several times in my life, and I'm presently in a phase where I know it again. It's very useful for the all-day meditation, because if your mind becomes restless, reciting it tends to bring you pretty solidly back. And so I was reciting it, as I enjoy doing it in many circumstances, and I was reciting it very carefully, word by word, and really contemplating the words. And just the first lines: vanished the veils of light and shade, lifted every vapor of sorrow. Think about that, which I did at great length yesterday. Lifted every vapor of sorrow. And I can keep on reciting it. Sailed away all dawns of fleeting joy. Gone the dim sensory mirage. Love, hate, health, disease, life, death. Dim sensory mirage. Just as a wordsmith, I have to say, wow, it's really good. But as a devotee, the dim sensory mirage, you mean my life? You mean everything that I think is real? You mean the fact that even as I'm meditating, I'm thinking about dinner? You know, the dim sensory mirage gone? Like, what would it be like if it were really gone? And reciting through the whole poem, you know, colossal container eye of all things made, all space like an iceberg floats within my mental sea. I thought to myself, you know, I'm a serious devotee, and I've been a serious devotee for a really long time. I've really done effectively nothing else with my life but this. I say to people sometimes, I'm extremely well educated in a very narrow field. You know, I know this really well, and I know practically nothing else. But I do know this because I've been serious about it. But I could see when I was meditating that I'm a little child looking up, you know, and I look up, and some of it dribbles down, and it makes this dim sensory mirage a lot more cheerful than it would be if I didn't have that. You know, there's as Jaya, one of our acharyas in India, when asked about his spiritual realization, he gave a very thoughtful Jaya-esque answer, because he's thoughtful and he's himself. And he didn't want to be dishonest, but he said simply, I've developed the capacity to choose happiness. Now, to someone who's looking for a lot of phenomenon, a lot of flashing lights, and a lot of dissolution of the dim sensory mirage and all of those other things, that might not sound like much. But for a person who's actually tried to live in this world and live on the spiritual path, the capacity to choose happiness is nearly infinite in its implications. So, nonetheless, the fact that this world is really, as Master said, if you knew my consciousness, if you could really see the spiritual eye and just step into it, if we could actually live, you know, in the reality of Christ, and what's so nice about that? When Swami Kriyananda, because he said it, and when he was a young monk in Self-Realization Fellowship, living with Master gave him a very public position. But he was very young and he looked young. So Master suggested he grow a beard because he thought it would give him more gravitas. People would take him a little more seriously. But at that time, very few men wore beards. So when the local Masonic organization in Los Angeles wanted to do a tableau and somebody needed to play Jesus, Swami says this is the reason, because he had a beard, they invited him to do it. I suspect that there were other aspects that caused them, but that was his explanation. So he played the part of Jesus, and he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he leaned against the rock and periodically sighed heavily. That's more or less how he described his part. And it was just a tableau, so he had no lines. And so afterwards, and apparently there was, I don't know what else happened, but afterwards Master said to him, you know, how did it go? And Master had heard compliments, and Master said, well, I heard, that you did a good job. And Swamiji said, well, I'd much rather be like Jesus than merely look like him. And Master's response, Swami said, was completely matter of fact. Oh, that will come, that will come. Just like that. Not saying that's presumptuous and you poor soul, you've got thousands of lifetimes. Nothing like that. He just said, of course. Because once you put your foot on this path, somebody, because I have so many videos on the internet now, I've begun to get lots of letters from people that I have not met, but they've met me. It's lots of fun. So someone wrote me, he's an Indian man, and Indians often sort of ask you like classic questions. They must collect them like autographs. Classic questions. What is your advice for me to have spiritual success? And I haven't answered his email because all I want to say is don't quit. And I know he's hoping for more than that. And I've been trying to find other words, but don't quit. Once you put your foot on the path, think how many lifetimes it takes us before we actually put our foot on the path. And all we have to do after that is not quit. And that spiritual eye will appear, and it will draw us to the Christ, just as it drew the 3 wise men. And Jesus will descend in answer to our call if we just don't quit. And even if our devotion is an affectation and a thought for a while, assume a virtue though you have it not, and do our best to make that which will eventually be the spontaneous response of our hearts, make it a conscious decision of the mind, an actual act of the will, until the relationship is formed, until it becomes like the mother and father and the grandparents with that new baby. We don't decide to love. Even I, who've never even met these children, some of whom are probably quite unpleasant, I feel so enamored of them. And then every once in a while, somebody brings you a baby that you just see, and you think, wow, old friend, there you are. There's my buddy. And I know that's how a lot of parents, I've never had children, but that's how a lot of parents say, it's not only that this child is mine, it's that this is an old friend. Here is my old friend. Now, the friendships we have that are defined by our bodies, of course, many of them exist before and exist long after. The bodily form is only incidental. But eternal friendship, eternal commitment, knowing every thought and loving us just who we are, what a friend we have in Jesus. People say that. And it doesn't have to be Jesus. It can be Master. It can be Divine Mother. It can be any form you want. But don't just think about God or even think to God. Love God. Make God your best friend. This is the salient characteristic of human life, is loneliness. And even no matter how dear and close our friendships are, nothing will ever satisfy us except that perfect, infinite love. And the great good news, it's that it's there for the receiving, if we but turn our attention and ask. God bless you.
There is no rose of such virtue as is the rose that bare Jesus. There is no rose of such virtue as is the rose that bare Jesus. There is no rose of such rose that bare Jesus. For in his rose contained was heaven and earth in little space. There is no rose of such virtue as is the rose that bare Jesus. The angels sung, the shepherds too, Gloria in excelsis Deo. There is no rose of such virtue as is the